All right, everyone, we're going to get going. It's about 12:01. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to get a federal update from Patrick Wall at NAR. He's going to talk about the topic of the day, 1031 exchange and what the future holds, but he's got a lot of other great information that he's going to share. Today's program, I have on here that it'll go noon to 1, but it's going to go 12 to 12:30. We're going to make this real quick and short. Our Lunch and Learns, as you all know, highlight companies and issues from our members and our partners. You are all on mute and your videos are all hidden. If you have questions, please use the chat function or ask in the question and answer. Many of you also submitted questions ahead of time that I will go through with Patrick if he doesn't address them in his presentation. Today's program is sponsored by Landmark Credit Union. They are presenting sponsor for the Lunch and Learn series, along with the 2021 CarW annual sponsors. We're grateful for all of their support. Here's a little rundown of the upcoming programs. We have a lot coming up, so please mark your calendars. Everything is on the CarW website for you to sign up through. If you have questions, let me know. Again, today's presenter is Patrick Wall, Political Representative Advocacy for NAR, the National Association of Realtors. He is a partner, always willing to take the call, answer the questions. And without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Patrick.
Well, thanks, Tracy. I appreciate you inviting me and the warm introduction, of course. I'm just going to share my slides here. So as Tracy mentioned, I am a political rep with NAR, so I deal a lot with our government affairs teams, with our lobbying team in Washington, try to maintain close contact with all those folks and work a lot with our political activity when we get into the swing of campaign season. So a lot of fun when that happens. I'm sure this cycle will be no different. So Tracy listed my information there on her slides earlier, and my cell phone is here as well. Please always feel free to reach out, to take down my information, to call my cell, email me with any questions you might have, or go through Tracy about anything NAR, whether it's political, policy, or anything where you don't know where to go. I can serve as that go-to person. So with that, I'll just sort of jump into things. There's a lot going on in Washington right now, as you can imagine. So I'd like to talk briefly about a little bit of the political and legislative landscape, talk about the proposals, two main proposals on infrastructure that are being discussed now, and then I'll address some of the other issues that the industry is facing right now. So first, the political landscape, I think, is important just to provide some context to how all of these decisions are made and how it's all shaped by the politics of the day. It also plays into the likelihood of things passing. As you can see, the House and the Senate are very, very divided, 50-50 in the Senate, with the Vice President casting a tie vote, and of course, a very slim majority for Democrats in the House, and an election around the corner. So this sort of colors every decision that's made, as well as changes that are being made right now with redistricting. Obviously, Wisconsin is not affected, but it's a calculation that House leaders have in other places for sure. So with that little bit of background about the politics of things and how it's impacting proposals as we see them today, I'll jump into the two main infrastructure bills that the Biden administration is proposing. There's sort of been three main pieces of legislation or big ideas that the Biden administration has proposed so far. The first one was the COVID related bill. It was a stimulus. That's already passed. And we can talk about how some of that plays into other issues of the day later. But what I want to focus on today are the two infrastructure bills. The first one is just a sort of plain old infrastructure bill about surface transportation, roads, bridges, that sort of thing. Your classic infrastructure. And the second is sort of what's being referred to in the administration as human infrastructure. It's childcare and schools and that sort of thing. You might wonder why are we talking about this? And the reason is because of how it's all paid for, and that will tie into 1031, into different tax proposals that the administration has and how it impacts real estate. And I'll just pause here and mention too, I'm going to go through all these slides, but I will take questions at the end on any of these issues. And I know there were some that were submitted earlier as well. So before I jump in, I think it's important just to note these are just proposals. They are just ideas. There is not legislative text out there. And so that really just goes to show you that things can change and things are going to change. But I'll talk about what has been proposed in the form of those ideas. So the first bill is the American Jobs Plan. This, like I said, is mostly general infrastructure, roads, bridges, rail, that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of housing related pieces in here. Housing is obviously front and center for a lot of legislators in Washington, especially with the market on fire and a crunch. So there's money for broadband, all sorts of tax credit related issues, improvement for housing infrastructure, all things that we generally support. But again, nothing in the form of a bill yet. This is all sort of discussion at this point. The important piece is really how this is paid for. And this particular bill, as it relates to taxes and real estate, is a little less related in the pay-fors to our industry. But I think it's important just to mention them. Obviously, one of the big pieces here is the corporate tax rate, which has been discussed. The administration has proposed moving it up to 28%. That was recently cut in 2017 with the Trump tax cuts, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It would still be even what the administration is proposing to raise it to would still be a decrease, as you can see, from where it stood just a few years ago, but still a big part of the discussion. There's also lots of information about discouraging companies from putting their headquarters abroad and paying taxes in that way. There's a whole proposal about a global minimum tax. I won't get into that. I also won't pretend to understand 100% how that works, but it mostly will not impact companies unless they're multinational, which I assume is not most of our members, even on the commercial side. The biggest bill or biggest proposal that impacts us as it relates to these tax proposals and how the administration is proposing to pay for it is the American Families Plan. This is that human infrastructure type bill. I won't read all these here because you can all read for yourselves, but it's, as you can see, a lot of money for education, for pre-K, Pell Grants, lowering costs of insurance premiums, that sort of thing. Mostly that doesn't relate to real estate, obviously, but where it does relate is how it's paid for. And this is what you've all sort of been hearing about in the news lately when the discussion of 1031 and capital gains is mentioned. So the proposal is to raise the top margin of the top income tax bracket to 37 to almost 40%. And the second piece here is really to sort of marry that top bracket with capital gains from 20% to almost 40. So it would pretty much double that capital gains tax rate for households earning over $1 million. There's also a proposal for ending the stepped up basis on inheritance over $1 million. So people who inherit a piece of property would have to pay on the original value of that property and not the value of when they inherited it. Obviously big for small businesses, for their families, for farmers, that sort of thing. The biggest piece here, obviously, is as it relates to the 1031 like-kind exchange and ending it for gains over 500,000. Obviously, a huge impact on the commercial real estate industry. NAR is very, very focused on this now. This is, I would say, priority number one. We are currently doing all sorts of different things. It's a concentration of our lobbying team on Capitol Hill and the Senate and the House, and with leadership in all of the relevant committees who will be working on these bills. One positive thing I will share is that we really haven't heard a lot, even from Democratic members who might be a little more supportive of this because it's coming from the administration. One thing we haven't heard is really anyone who's actively pushing to make this change to 1031s. So that is a positive thing that we've seen just on Capitol Hill behind the scenes. But as I mentioned, we're working with a coalition of all sorts of different industry members, sending letters, meeting with the administration and people on Capitol Hill. And this is part of the same group of people that helped fight to preserve 1031 like-kind exchanges for real estate in 2017. As you might remember, 1031s were, there was discussion of getting rid of them entirely during the Trump tax bill in 2017. We were part of the discussion that saved them for real estate, which is obviously very key. So we're going to continue on that effort. We also have right now, for those of you who aren't familiar, we have, let's call them citizen lobbyists or realtor lobbyists, our federal political coordinators. We have a designated member for each member of Congress, a designated realtor for each member of Congress. And right now they're having meetings in lieu of what would be our in-person annual Capitol Hill fly-in. They're having meetings for the next 2 months with every member of Congress. And that's top of the agenda, something we're discussing with realtors and members of Congress, directly sharing their stories, making sure they understand why it's important, both in residential and commercial real estate. As you can see, a majority of realtors were involved in at least one transaction in the past 5 years, and it's obviously much higher in commercial real estate. This is bread and butter for a lot of people. We've been doing all sorts of other things on the educational front, providing members of Congress with information, statistics, studies about why this is so key to the industry. And one good piece is that this was no surprise to us because it was part of early campaign proposals by the Biden team. So we were able to open that dialogue early when we saw that and start the discussion about why this would be such a negative impact to our industry. I guess I'll talk just about sort of some of the things that we're stressing to members of Congress as we have these discussions on 1031. And the first one would be just that 1031 like-kind exchanges are not a tax giveaway. That's sort of a talking point we hear from some people who don't really know a lot about this issue. The 1031 has been around for over 100 years now, almost as long as the 16th Amendment has been around to allow federal taxation. So this is not something that has just been worked around and in the last few years, even decades. It's been a part of the tax code for a long time. We also try to note to members of Congress that 90% of the properties that are exchanged through 1031s end up paying taxes that are usually at a higher rate. On average, it's about 20% higher rate that properties exchanged through this tool pay in taxes. So we're stressing that it's a tool for small businesses as well. And finally, I'll just note one of the biggest goals of the administration right now in some of these infrastructure packages is to address the housing shortage, is to make sure that job growth continues and all of those things. And we're trying to explain to them that this is a tool that will help with the housing shortage. About 40% of like-kind exchanges are multifamily housing units, are used for multifamily housing units. So getting rid of that incentive to continue investing would be a huge detriment to that problem they're trying to solve. It's also obviously a huge jobs issue. About 500,000 jobs a year are created through this tool, through all sorts of things, both directly in real estate and indirectly in construction and all sorts of different things. So we're going to continue to push that. We're going to continue to educate members on why this is so important. And I think we're also going to need your help at some point if this ends up advancing in the form of a more concrete proposal. So I will share with Tracy a link for everyone, but we're trying to collect stories about 1031 right now so that we can share with members of Congress, especially in Wisconsin. It's always more impactful if we have stories from individual congressional districts or even just a state, especially in Milwaukee and Madison. If we have stories from those places where we can explain to members of Congress why this would be a bad move and have a negative impact, especially as it relates to investment in underserved communities, creating new jobs, creating new housing units, stories about women and minority-owned businesses, farmers and ranchers, all those sorts of different buckets. If you have a story that you might be willing to tell and share with a member of Congress, we're going to share that link with you so we can try to collect that and make sure that members of Congress understand why it's so important. So I'll be sure to share that with all of you. And just to close out this 1031 discussion, I'll end with a quote from Senator Joe Manchin, who I'm sure you all know is a key vote now in the Senate, moderate Democrat from West Virginia. He said, as you can see, the bill basically is not going to end up that way. When he was asked about the various tax proposals, capital gains, 1031, etc. There needs to be, generally speaking, 60 votes in the Senate to pass a bill. There are not 60 votes to pass something like this. There is a possibility of something called budget reconciliation, which allows for the Senate to pass various tax and spending measures by a simple majority. So it'd be 51 votes or 50 plus the vice president, which is obviously a possibility. But even with that, as you can see from the quote from Manchin, as well as what we've heard from other members of Congress, that doesn't seem likely at this point. So I share all this information about the proposals in 1031 and potential tax changes because I think it's important to remain vigilant about what's being talked about, obviously, but also to just level set and make sure people understand that we are a long way away from actual concrete measures here at this point. There are currently some bipartisan talks going on. It seems like those will probably end the week after Memorial Day. We might see a discussion about Democrats passing with a simple majority, but that's something we're paying attention to as the talks advance. With that, I'll move into some other issues people are seeing here, and then I'll pause for questions. Obviously, the federal eviction moratorium has been a huge issue the last over a year, and the biggest thing that we've been pushing for is rental assistance and making sure that there are clear guidelines for housing providers, for landlords, as that money is rolled out. Money has been given in various bills. I can't speak to exactly how it's been done in Wisconsin. It's different in every state, but our general goal has been to get rental assistance on the federal level and to send down to states, and then when the time is right, lift that eviction moratorium so the business of housing providers can sort of get back to usual here. Obviously, there are huge backloads of things. So there is litigation pending that on behalf of the Alabama and the Georgia Association of Realtors and some housing providers that we've been actively engaged on. Just to give you a overview of where that stands, the district court in DC struck down the eviction moratorium from the CDC. It is related to the CDC. We can get into that if anyone has questions, but a stay was granted earlier this month. So basically all this means is that the eviction moratorium is still in effect. It is set to end June 30th, but these developments remain. So we're continuing to stay involved there. As well, it's just important to note that state and localities might have their own moratoriums impacting this. So just be sure to pay attention to that. Just to touch on two more things here. worker status of realtor members, I think 90% plus of realtors across the country are independent contractors. There's been various proposals on the legislative side as well as the administrative side in the Biden administration to change some of those things. There was a Trump rule that we supported that provided some clarity on worker status that was rescinded by the Biden administration, which we were not happy to see, but we're continuing to work with them just to make sure that they understand that clarity is really important in our industry for our workers and their status who choose to work this way for the flexibility and those sorts of things. So you may have heard about the PRO Act, which is the measure that passed the House, a labor-related bill. It doesn't really impact real estate. In fact, most of these discussions don't impact real estate because they're related to gig workers, Uber drivers, Lyft, food delivery, that sort of thing. But we just worry that passing any broad sweeping measures could have an impact on the flexibility and of our members that they enjoy. So we're continuing to push on that and make sure there's clarity and those things aren't impacted too drastically. The last piece I'll touch here is the foreclosure moratorium. This is also set to end at the end of next month. And there is an extension possible. It remains to be seen if it will actually happen. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is working on a potential rule. We've commented on that with changes and with our concerns. Also, individual agencies who have loans like the VA or the Department of Agriculture, et cetera, could issue their own individual extensions, but there's been really no talk of that yet. So we will continue to update folks and make our voice heard as those discussions advance. So with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions that.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. I think you probably answered a lot of questions and you probably created a lot more. So if folks have questions they want to put in the chat function, please do that. I'll go through a couple that we had coming up over the course of the call. Can you talk a little bit about the advocacy efforts that we might engage our members in terms of calls for action? What does the timing look like for that, if any?
Sure. So that's a great question. Obviously, as an association with 1.4 million members, we are lucky to have voices in every congressional district and every state in both the commercial and the residential space. So there is the potential for calls for action later down the line. We might ask people to call their member of Congress, to send them an email, to write them a letter. That would all take place likely after a bill is introduced, which looks like probably next month. And these discussions take place over a longer course of time. So as those negotiations push and it's introduced in the House, where a bill would start likely because it's related to revenue and tax, be on the lookout for emails, for calls for action over text or from NAR or from CARW, of course, but nothing imminent because there is no proposal yet, as I mentioned. But it's certainly something that we're gonna push on as these things move forward.
No, I think that's really smart because I know that there are a lot of other groups who are involved in this and at different stages. Their strategies say, let's deploy now and get people engaged now. I think one of the great things that NAR does really well is you keep in touch with the members through the survey. And I know that you collect that data about the number and percentage of realtors who participate in a 1031 exchange because you send out these surveys and you're keeping them engaged and keeping them in touch. And we appreciate all of the communication that we get related to those efforts as well.
And if I could say one thing about that as well, I think obviously the proposal as it stands now is with regard to 1031 would impact gains over 500,000. And so what we're looking at now is surveying members in particular who might engage in those transactions and get a more full picture of how exactly that would impact the industry. So we're beginning that as well. So thank you for mentioning that.
As far as collecting that comprehensive information, though, how do you go about gathering that? Because it is so difficult to track it state by state because of so many multi-state transactions. What is this resource that you look to that, or is there anything that we can do to help you get better information?
Well, we're lucky to have we actually have a team of economists and a survey team who work on these things and try to make sure that we have good data. Because obviously, like you said, it's difficult to track these transactions, especially across 50 states. So I think one of the best things right now, especially as it relates to 1031, would be obviously we are surveying people, but there is a link that I can pop in the chat about sharing stories about 1031 and your business and how changes might be how the changes might negatively impact your community and your business individually. So please reach out, please share those stories.
We'll share that broadly.
Creating everything, yeah.
We'll share that broadly with the membership. A question came through, that $500,000 cap, is that per year, per transaction, or is it applied at the entity or ownership level?
Good question. I don't think that they've actually, on the second piece about entity or owner level, I don't think that they've actually rolled out specifics on how exactly it would apply. That's just how not far they are into the process. With regards to if it's per transaction or per year, I believe that it's I'm not 100% sure, so I'll have to get back on that because I don't want to speak incorrectly.
Nope, that's fair. And like you said, all of this is kind of it's an idea right now. And oh, I just had another response. There's no language yet. That's how new it is. Yeah. We're so far ahead of the curve right now that there's no language currently proposed. But I think they're throwing out numbers because it's getting us all kind of interested and engaged in this discussion. So am I hearing that you think you're hearing that this won't necessarily move forward through reconciliation? Or are you hearing that that's the best bet if something were to happen?
So what we're hearing right now is that Leader Schumer is discussing with the parliamentarian of the Senate, because that's how this works. It's not an actual law that exists about passing things through this reconciliation process. It's just a Senate rule. And so they are discussing that now. It seems silly because it's sort of a very bureaucratic way to do things. What it seems like is going to happen now is that is the most likely way that they would pass this, because the only way they would be able to do it with the 60-vote threshold is through some bipartisan talks, and that doesn't really seem likely. We'll probably know the end of those talks by next week, by the end of next week, and whether anything comes out of them. But I would say reconciliation is the most likely way that they would go about passing this. But as I mentioned, even though that's a lower threshold, you still need 50 votes, and there are plenty of friendly Democrats who understand why this is so important to us, who we are working with to hopefully insist on those changes. So while it's a lower bar, it's still a difficult threshold that has to be met.
Are you seeing any increase in activity as a result of, when I say pending changes, but are you seeing an increase in activity because people are fearful of the changes that could come?
That's a great question. I don't have any data on that I know of right now about increased transactions. But one of the things that we've been sort of warning about is that I think the idea here is that this is going to get people to start moving when these changes are made. And our view is that a lot of people are probably just going to sit on these properties and not necessarily sell because a 1031 exchange is gotten rid of. So that sort of works against their goal of getting things moving in the market. So that's a point we're trying to make to people that on the Hill, is that we don't think this is going to spur as much revenue as you think it will for those reasons.
No, great. Well, and hopefully that message rings true. There's so much historical evidence of creating those disincentives for movement. We did get a note from a reliable tax resource that there is noticeable uptick in property sales in advance of potential tax increases, which almost seem inevitable, but all of the pushes and pulls and unintended and intended consequences may or may not be there. Had a question come in about opportunity zones. That hasn't come up. We haven't talked about that in a while. Is there anything out there about changes to that?
Yeah, great question. So obviously there are deadlines that are coming up this year in order for people to take advantage of them. A lot of those various deadlines were extended because the pandemic obviously made things difficult. The short answer is no. At this point, there is no concrete discussion about making any changes to the program. But of course, we're going to continue to monitor that as those talks do take place. But as of now, no.
Great. Are there any other questions from the group? I think we answered all of those that were shared from our feedback. Some people were saying they didn't realize that it was in potential trouble. Talking about the reconciliation. I think, offering up your contact information as a resource is wonderful. We'll alert everyone to watch for those surveys as they come out from NAR, because they are so vitally important for you to develop those stories. And then also, if people have firsthand experience with a 1031 exchange, and I know they're out there because I did get calls about them during COVID closures, because that was problematic getting people through there. So please reach out and I will connect you to Patrick. And if you have questions about anything, I get updates from Patrick a couple times a week. I actually turn a lot of that around in our weekly newsletter and share that with you, but he is a direct resource for anyone about any issue. And if he doesn't know the answer, they have a huge team at NAR that is able to help. So anything else, Patrick?
No, that's pretty much it for me. I appreciate you having me on. I put my cell phone and email in the chat. I know Tracy will share it with you as well. So as she mentioned, please keep a line of contact open, share your stories, and we'll keep people updated as things develop, and keep an eye on these changes and continue to make sure everyone's voice is in the room as this moves forward. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, great. Have a great day, everyone. We'll wrap this up and we'll share the slides as well. Watch for that in the next day or so. Have a good one.